My name is Sarah Bennett. I am 38 years old. I was standing at the edge of Millbrook High School's football field with a plastic cup of lukewarm punch in my hand when the helicopter came over the tree line, and I knew before I turned around that my 15-year reunion had just become something that none of us would forget for the rest of our lives. The sound reached me before it reached anyone else. It always does. I have been hearing rotor blades for 12 years, and my brain processes that sound the way most people's brains process their own name. Low-frequency percussion in the middle distance. Consistent, powered, getting closer. I turned south before the crowd did, before the sound was loud enough for anyone else to peel it away from the ambient October noise, and I watched the red and white Sikorsky S-92 come in low over the oak trees at the far end of the field, its running lights blinking orange and white in the early dusk, the downdraft already beginning to flatten the grass before the aircraft crossed the 50-yard line. The market lights along the sidelines swayed on their wires. Someone dropped a plate. A woman pulled a child close to her side. 3 or 4 phones went up immediately, aimed at the sky. People scrambled away from the center of the field, the instinctive movement of a crowd that understands it is in the presence of something that requires space. A folding table tipped, plastic cups skittered across the turf, and one of them rolled all the way to the end zone. I stood still. Derek Holloway was 3 feet to my left, and I did not look at his face when the helicopter descended. But I was aware of him the way you are aware of a person who has recently said something small and unkind to you in front of other people. I was aware that he was a commercial airline pilot and that he would recognize exactly what he was watching. I was aware that what he was watching was not the clumsy approach of an uncertain pilot, but something precise and deliberate and very well done. The aircraft touched down on the 40-yard line. The door opened. 3 people in orange flight suits stepped out. 2 women I did not recognize, and a man I thought was from the night crew at Burlington. They moved to the side in the practiced way of people who have done things like this before and do not find it remarkable. They stood on the grass of my old high school's football field like it was any landing zone, because to them it was. Then Marcus Webb stepped out. He was 52 years old, and he wore a dark jacket, and his hair had gone almost entirely white since January. And he stood on the 40-yard line and looked across the crowd until he found me. It didn't take him long. I was the only person on the field who hadn't moved. He said my name. He said it the way you say a name you have been saying to yourself for a long time. I want to tell you how we got there. I grew up in Millbrook, Vermont, which is the kind of place that is beautiful in a way that requires you to be from there to fully appreciate, and which seems small to the people passing through it, and exactly the right size to the people who stay. My father flew crop dusters out of a field in Addison County. He was not a talkative man. He was a precise man, which is a different thing. He could tell you in 3 words what another person would take a paragraph to say, and the 3 words were always correct. He took me up in his plane before I could see over the instrument panel, which I now understand was probably not entirely consistent with any regulation, but was entirely consistent with the man he was. He handed me the headset and let me listen to the engine and the air traffic from Burlington. And he didn't tell me flying was something girls didn't do. And he didn't tell me it was something they especially did either. He just let me listen. When I was 11 years old, I was walking home from a friend's house, and I saw a medical helicopter land in the parking lot of a grocery store 3 blocks from my house. A man had collapsed in the frozen food aisle. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the helicopter come down and stabilize and then go back up again. And I felt something in my chest that I did not have words for at 11, but would spend the rest of my life trying to describe. It wasn't the machine itself. The machine was interesting, but machines were always interesting. It was what the machine was doing. It was going somewhere specific, for a specific reason, at a moment when a specific thing was needed, regardless of whether it was the most convenient time or the most comfortable conditions or the most prestigious destination. It showed up because showing up was what it was for. I was not a visionary at 11 years old. I want to be clear about that. I was a kid with grass-stained jeans who ate too many of her father's peanut butter crackers and cried at the wrong parts of movies. I was not quietly extraordinary. I was paying attention. There is a difference. And confusing one for the other causes no end of problems. Millbrook High School in the fall of 2004 was a school of roughly 400 students, and one of those students was Derek Holloway. Derek was 2 seats behind me in honors biology and 1 table over in calculus, and approximately 3 years ahead of me in the ongoing project of knowing exactly who he was going to become. He was athletic in the way that filled hallways. He was confident in a way that filled rooms. He was not a cruel person, exactly. He was competitive in a way that required someone to be losing in order for him to feel like he was winning, and I was a useful person to be competitive against because I was quiet enough that I would not make a scene about it and just skilled enough at things that beating me felt like it meant something. We both applied to the flight program at the University of Vermont in the fall of 2007. We both got in. We spent 4 years in a kind of parallel that is strange to sustain with someone who is not your friend and not your enemy. Someone who is simply another person pursuing a version of the same thing you are pursuing in a way that is not quite the same as your way. We were not close. We were not hostile. We were two people moving through the same curriculum with different centers of gravity. And I suspect that what I wanted from flying and what Derek wanted from it were different enough that they would have become apparent at some point regardless. After graduation, I flew for a regional carrier for 2 years. I was competent, I was reliable, I paid my rent on time, and I got enough sleep, and I did the job well. But somewhere in the second year, I started thinking about the grocery store parking lot. I thought about it on long approaches over farmland at altitudes where everything below looked flat and organized. I thought about it in hotel rooms in cities I had no personal connection to. I thought about what it had felt like to watch a machine arrive specifically for a single purpose and depart the moment that purpose was served. I applied to a search and rescue program with the Vermont Department of Public Safety in the fall of 2012. The training was 8 months, and it required things of me that the regional carrier had not required, which I do not say as a criticism of commercial flying, and which anyone who has not trained for SAR should understand before they assume they know what those requirements are. I received my certification in a ceremony that my father attended. He drove 2 hours and shook my hand because he was not a hugger, and stood next to me for photographs with an expression that existed somewhere between proud and completely unsurprised, which was the most expressive he ever got about anything, and which I understood perfectly. Derek Holloway went on to fly for a major commercial carrier. I know this because Millbrook was small enough and the internet was large enough, and both of those facts conspired to make it essentially impossible to lose track of people you had grown up with, even if you had no particular interest in tracking them. He was flying international routes within 5 years. There was a photograph on his social media page of him standing at a gate in Zurich next to a wide-body aircraft, and he was smiling in the specific way of a man who has arrived at the place he was heading and is satisfied that the heading was correct. I did not begrudge Derek Holloway any of that. I want to say that plainly and have it believed, because it is true. His choices were not my choices, and his life was not my life, and the way he measured his success had no claim on the way I measured mine. I thought about him the way you think about weather in a city you used to live in, occasionally, without urgency. The 15-year reunion was held on the second Saturday in October, in the gymnasium and on the adjacent football field, which had been strung with market lights and dressed up with rented linen and vases of flowers on folding tables, all of which made it look like something other than what it was, and all of which stopped mattering about 4 minutes after people started arriving, because people always create the environment they're in rather than the one that's been set up for them. I arrived at 6:45, which was 15 minutes before the doors opened, because I arrived everywhere 15 minutes before the doors opened, a habit I had acquired in a profession where arriving late to something was not a recoverable situation, and which I had given up expecting myself to change. I sat in my old Jeep in the parking lot and finished the last of my thermos of coffee and looked at the school. I tried to determine whether I had strong feelings about it and concluded that I did not. I had attended it. I had learned things there. I had eaten lunch alone sometimes, and sometimes with Jen Caldwell, who was my best friend in high school and had remained my best friend in the way that some friendships survive simply because both people are too stubborn to let them decay. Jen was a 5th grade teacher now, in Burlington. She had a gift for explaining things to people who were actively resisting explanation, which had served her equally well in a classroom and at every dinner party and family occasion I had ever watched her navigate. I went inside when the doors opened and found Jen in under a minute, because Jen Caldwell moved through rooms the way certain people did, like she had already decided before she arrived that she was glad to be there and was going around confirming it. She handed me a glass of sparkling water and looked me over with the specific attention of someone who has known you since you were 14. She said, "You look exactly the same." I said, "That's either a compliment or a commentary on Arrested Development." She said, "It's both," and she hugged me. The first 2 hours were fine in the way that reunions are fine, which is to say that they were occasionally warm and occasionally strange and occasionally both at once. I talked to a woman named Priya who had become an architect in Montreal and described her current project with the breathless precision of someone who has finally arrived at the work they were meant to do. I talked to a man named Curtis who had come back to Millbrook to take over his family's hardware store after his father's stroke and who had achieved a particular kind of peace about this that stopped surprising me the longer I thought about it. People arrived at their lives by different roads. Some of the roads were the ones they chose and some were the ones that were available, and the difference between those two things was not always as visible from the outside as people assumed. Around 8 o'clock, Derek Holloway came across the room toward where I was standing with Jen near the gymnasium door. He had 2 men with him, Mark something and a tall red-haired man whose name I had not recovered from wherever it had settled in the years since graduation. Derek looked as I had expected him to look at 38, which was like a slightly more concentrated version of what he had been at 18. He wore the kind of ease that comes from having spent 15 years being right about your choices. He had a drink in his hand and he stopped in front of us and said my name like finding me there was a pleasant surprise, which it was, possible it was. He said, "Sarah Bennett, look at you. Still flying?" I said yes. He said, "Still doing the rescue thing?" I said yes. He said, "I heard you had a shot at a regional route a few years back." He paused for a moment that was not quite a smile. "What happened with that?" I said, "I took the rescue job instead." He said, Right. He nodded. He said, "Well, not everyone's cut out for commercial. Nothing wrong with that. I have spent 12 years making decisions under time pressure, and the most important thing I have learned about that is that the first response your brain generates is not always the one you should use." I waited 1 beat. Then I said, "I think you might be confusing chosen with failed, Derek. It's an easy mix-up to make." He made a sound that landed somewhere between a laugh and something less generous. He said, "No offense. I just mean commercial takes a certain kind of precision, a different skill set." Mark, something said, "Yeah, and the hours are brutal," in the tone of a man contributing to a conversation in which he has no stake and should therefore say nothing. I looked at Derek for a moment. I said, "I landed a Sikorsky S-92 inches, a Category 3 ground blizzard with 0 visibility, a 17-knot crosswind, and a makeshift landing zone the size of a basketball court in the dark in January, with 9 people waiting to die if I got the approach wrong. But yes, different skill set." Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Derek said, "I'm sure that was intense," in the particular tone that signals a person has decided to be unimpressed by something and has chosen tone as the mechanism of that decision. I excused myself and went to get more coffee from the table by the door. Jen was at my side approximately 30 seconds later. She had seen the full exchange from 12 feet away, with the specific attention she brought to anything involving people she loved being treated carelessly. She said, "Do you want me to accidentally spill something on him?" I said, "It's fine." She said, "It's not fine, but I'll respect your call." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The thing you just described. The blizzard landing. That was the Kelton Ridge rescue, wasn't it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "God, Sarah," just quietly. She said, "I read about that." I said, "It was the crew. It's always the crew." She said, "I know it's the crew, but you were the one flying the helicopter." I said, "Someone else designed it, and someone else maintains it, and someone else trained me. So where exactly does the team end and the individual begin?" She looked at me with the expression she reserved for arguments she knew she was not going to win and did not intend to stop making. She said, "Fine. But you should know that Derek has been telling Mark that you washed out of commercial because you couldn't pass the instrument certification." I looked at my coffee. I said, "That's not what happened." She said, "I know that's not what happened." I said, "Let it go, Jen." She said she would try, in the tone that meant she would try for approximately 4 minutes. I went outside at around 8:30. The night had the particular quality of Vermont in October. Clear and cool and honest. A sky doing what Vermont skies did in October, which was showing off without apology. The market lights made warm circles along the sidelines of the football field, and people moved through them in groups of 2 and 3. I stood at the edge of the field with my coffee and did not think about anything specific. I thought about my father. I thought about the helicopter in the parking lot when I was 11. I thought about the kind of quiet that lives inside a cockpit when the ground is still far below and everything you have is being asked for and everything you have is enough. I also thought about the fact that I had left the gym because I needed air, and that I had needed air because somewhere in the second hour of the reunion, the cumulative weight of being in a room full of people who had formed opinions about my life without the benefit of accurate information had become something I wanted to put down for a few minutes. This was not new. You could not work in search and rescue for 12 years without becoming comfortable with the fact that most people did not understand what search and rescue was. They thought it was brave, or they thought it was reckless, or they thought it was a consolation prize. What it was, in reality, was a specific and highly trained skill applied to the worst moments in other people's lives, at hours that were not convenient and in conditions that were not ideal, without the benefit of doing it again if you got the first attempt wrong. Derek Holloway did not understand this, and the version of the story he had been circulating through the reunion about my professional history was not only incorrect in its facts, but wrong in its premise, which was that the choice I had made was the result of something I couldn't do rather than something I decided. The difference between those two things is the entire difference, but explaining it to Derek would not have changed his account to Mark or to anyone else he had told it to, and I had not been in the business of explaining myself to people who had already decided what they thought since approximately 2008, when I had learned that the energy spent on that project was better directed elsewhere. I stood at the edge of the field and drank my cold coffee and watched the October sky and thought about a January night I will now describe to you. The call came in on January 17th at 9:47 in the evening. A research team from the University of Vermont, 9 people, including a field physician named Marcus Webb, had been conducting winter ecology work in the Kelton Ridge area when a front moved through approximately 4 hours ahead of any forecast. The wind went from 12 knots to 40 in under an hour. The temperature dropped 23 degrees Fahrenheit in that same window. The emergency shelter the team had established was rated for conditions that no longer existed. One of the team members, a 24-year-old doctoral student named Anna Kessler, had developed hypothermia that Marcus Webb was managing with the resources available to him, which were not adequate for the rate at which her condition was deteriorating. We launched at 10:15. The weather was bad from the moment we left the ground. My co-pilot was a man named Paul Derek, who was one of the most careful and technically excellent pilots I have worked with in 12 years. He read me the conditions 3 times during the flight. He was not being pessimistic. He was being accurate. The ceiling was dropping. Visibility was declining. The wind was gusting in a pattern that made prediction unreliable. The margin he described to me was not a comfortable margin. I heard every word he said. I also knew that 9 people were sitting in a shelter that was failing, that a hypothermic doctoral student's body temperature was dropping at a rate that Marcus Webb later told me he had calculated and found frightening, and that the call I was going to make was either the right call or there was not going to be a right call. I asked Paul to work the instruments. I flew by whatever combination of training and experience and 12 years of decisions was available to me at 10:41 on a January night over the Green Mountains of Vermont. I am not going to tell you it was calm. I am not going to tell you I was not frightened. I was frightened in the specific way I had learned to be frightened over 12 years, which was deeply and without interruption, but in a place that did not reach my hands. The landing zone Marcus Webb had chosen was a clearing with a diameter of approximately 15 meters, which he had selected because it was the largest flat space he could find that was not tree-covered. I came in at an approach angle I would not put in any training manual. I set the aircraft down with a jolt that knocked a panel loose in the cabin and gave Paul Derek a bruise on his shoulder that lasted 2 weeks. We loaded 9 people in 11 minutes. We were back on the ground in Burlington at 1:18 in the morning. 3 of the 9 required hospitalization. Anna Kessler spent 4 days in the ICU. She left the hospital on her own feet. Marcus Webb shook my hand in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning and said something to me that I remembered as a general impression of gratitude, but would not recall in its specific words until the night he repeated them on the tam. 40-yard line of my old high school's football field. I did not tell any of this to anyone at the reunion in detail. I told the compressed version to Derek Holloway, who reduced it to a different skill set in under 30 seconds, which told me what I needed to know about what a fuller account would have accomplished. Jen came out to the field eventually and stood next to me. She understood, in the way that she understood most things about me after 23 years, that silence was not always a problem requiring solution. We stood together for a while without talking. The music from inside drifted through the gymnasium doors. Someone had chosen a playlist from our graduating year, which meant that certain songs arrived with small, involuntary memories attached, the kind that surfaced before you could make a decision about whether to feel them. Jen said, eventually, "You okay?" I said I was fine. She said, "I know you're fine. I'm asking if you're okay." Those are different questions, and the fact that Jen could distinguish them was one of the reasons I had kept her in my life for 2 decades and 3 years. I thought about it honestly. I said, I'm tired of being in a room full of people who knew me when and are comparing what I've become to what they imagined I would be. She said, "Welcome to every reunion ever held." I said, "I know, it's still tiring." She said, "Derek told Mark that you could have had a shot at United's training program, but you blew the final check ride." I laughed. I said, "That's not even remotely what happened." She said, "I know. What did actually happen?" I said, "I got the offer. I turned it down. That's the complete story." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You turned down United." I said, "Yes." She said, "When?" I said, 2013. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because it didn't feel like news." I had already decided. The telling would have made it seem like it was harder than it was. She shook her head. She said, "Sarah, I love you, but you have a self-promotion problem that approaches the clinical." I said, "I promote things I think deserve it." She said, "You saved 9 people in a blizzard." I said, "My crew saved 9 people in a blizzard. I flew the aircraft." She said the most frustrating thing about this was not that I was being modest, but that I clearly believed what I was saying. I said, "Because it's true." We stood there. The music played inside. The market lights moved slightly on their lines in a wind off the northeast that was cold in the particular way that October in Vermont is cold, which is direct and without any pretense of warmth. Then I heard the rotors. I heard them before they were audible to anyone else on that field, in the specific way that I had been hearing rotors for 12 years, as a frequency my brain had been trained to sort out of ambient sound without effort. Low percussion in the south, getting louder and more specific with each second. I turned toward the tree line. Jen said, "What?" I said, "Helicopter." She looked at me. Then it came over the trees. The S-92 came in from the south at an altitude of maybe 200 feet, running lights blinking in the early October dark, and the sound hit the crowd a moment after it hit me, and then the crowd started moving. People stepped back from the 50-yard line. The market lights swayed on their wires. Someone called out to move the tables. A plate went over on the grass. The children in the crowd did the thing children do, which was look immediately at the nearest adult to find out whether this was exciting or frightening. And then, when the nearest adult looked excited, decided on excited. I stood at the edge of the field with both hands around my coffee cup. The aircraft settled onto the 40-yard line. The descent was controlled and precise in the way that controlled and precise descents look when you know what you're looking at. The wheels touched the grass with a weight that was exactly the weight they were meant to carry. The rotors began to slow. The door opened. 3 people in orange flight suits stepped out. Then Marcus Webb stepped onto the grass of Millbrook High School's football field in a dark jacket, and he looked across the crowd with the directness of a man who had not flown here to look at a crowd, and he found me before I had taken a single step toward him. He said, "Sarah Bennett." His voice carried across the field in the way voices carry when a crowd goes quiet all at once, which this crowd did. I said, "Hello, Marcus." He walked across the field toward me. He was not a tall man, and he walked with a slight hitch in his left side that had not been there in January and that I noticed immediately. He reached me and extended his hand. I took it. He said, "I have been trying to find the right way to do this for 9 months." I said, "You didn't have to do anything." He said, "I know I didn't. That is not what I said." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded envelope. He held it in both hands for a moment with the care of someone who has been carrying something he did not want to damage. He held it out to me. He said, "This is from all 9 of us. It's also specifically from Anna Kessler, who asked me to make certain you knew that she finished her dissertation and she's defending it in December and she would like you to be there if you're willing to come." I took the envelope. I did not open it. He said, "I want to say something out loud, and I want to say it here in front of these people because I'm a physician and I understand that certain things have to be said in front of witnesses to land the way they need to land." He looked at me with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided exactly what they are going to say and has waited a long time to say it. He said, "On January 17th, my team was going to die. Not as one possibility among several. We were going to die. The hypothermia was advancing. The shelter was failing at a rate that I was calculating in real time and finding very bad. We had done everything correctly up to the point where the conditions made everything we had done correctly irrelevant. And you flew a helicopter into conditions that your own co-pilot described as past the margin of safety. And you landed it in a space I can now tell you I chose out of approximately equal parts assessment and desperation. And you loaded 9 people in 11 minutes and you flew back out. And every person who was in that clearing that night is alive. I am alive. Anna Kessler is finishing a dissertation on winter ecology and planning to defend it in front of a committee in December." He paused. He said, "I don't know what they taught you in flight school, and I don't know what in your life made you willing to make that decision at 10:41 on a January night when every instrument and every calculation was telling you the sensible answer was no. But whatever it is, I would like more of it in the world." I did not know what to say. I said, "You had done everything right on your end. It didn't seem fair to not show up." He looked at me for a moment. Then he almost smiled, the very small smile of a man who had expected exactly that answer. The crew chief from the helicopter, the older woman in the orange suit, came forward and handed Marcus something. It was a framed certificate, heavy and official, with the seal of the Vermont Department of Public Safety in the upper corner, and text I was seeing for the first time. Marcus held it out with both hands. He said, "The department gave the official commendation to the crew. That's right, because it was a crew operation. But we wanted you to have something that had your name on it." I took it. I looked at it. My name was on it. Sarah A. Bennett. It said the words presented in recognition of exceptional skill, courage, and judgment in the Kelton Ridge Search and Rescue Operation, January 17th. It carried the signature of the commissioner and 3 department chiefs. And below those, in a column along the lower half of the document, were 9 more signatures. 9 people who had stood in a deteriorating shelter in a ground blizzard in January and waited for a sound that said someone had decided to come anyway. At the bottom right corner, in small and careful letters, was the signature of Anna Kessler. I held the frame in both hands and looked at those 9 signatures for a long time. Marcus said, "She practiced her signature specifically for this occasion. She wanted it to be legible. She said to tell you it was the first time she had cared about penmanship since the 3rd grade." I laughed. It came out before I decided to let it, and I let it continue. Jen was beside me. I could feel her there without looking, and I knew without looking that she was crying in the specific way that Jen cried, which was in complete silence and with a dignity that she would defend if anyone mentioned it. The crowd around us was quiet in the way a crowd goes quiet when it understands it is witnessing something that belongs to 2 specific people and has been allowed to observe it. I was aware of 50 or 60 people from my graduating class standing on the football field of Millbrook High School under market lights in October watching a trauma surgeon present a certificate to a search and rescue pilot. I was aware of the weight of the frame in my hands and the specific texture of the paper beneath the glass. I was aware of Derek Holloway standing somewhere to my left. I did not look at him. I was not avoiding him. He simply was not where my attention was. Marcus and I talked for a while. He told me about the team. 3 of them had gone back into field research, working a different site with shelter rated for actual winter conditions. 1 had left the ecology program and was teaching environmental science at a middle school in Burlington, which Marcus described as a loss to research and a significant gain for that particular school. The man who had organized the original study was writing a paper on emergency preparedness protocols for winter fieldwork that had apparently become rather heated and specific and was not making him popular with certain grant committees who had signed off on the original expedition. He said, "Anna is the loudest of all of them," which is saying something. She has very strong opinions about what happened and what should happen differently. I said, "That sounds like someone who had a specific experience and turned it into something useful." He said, "That describes you too, you know?" I said, "I didn't know about that." He said, "I looked into your history before tonight." He said, "I hope that's not an intrusion." He said, 12 years with the department, 43 rescue operations, 31 junior pilots trained." I said the numbers were approximately right. He said, "Approximately." I said, 44 operations. There was one in April that got folded into a larger incident report. He nodded. He said, 44. He looked at me. He said, "That's not a person who didn't find their place." I did not say anything. He said, "I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "When you made the call to come in, when Derek told you the margin was gone, what were you thinking?" I thought about it. I said, "I wasn't thinking about the margin. I was thinking about the clearing. I was thinking about what the clearing needed from me and whether I could give it. The margin is a calculation about what is safe on average. The clearing was not an average situation." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "That's what I thought you were going to say. That's exactly what I thought you were going to say." The crew was preparing to leave. The rotors were turning again. People were backing up from the field in the same instinctive way as before, the same recognition of something that occupied space and made wind and needed room. Marcus shook my hand a final time. He said he hoped I would come to the dissertation defense. He said Anna had things she wanted to say to me in her own words, which he had been told were prepared and ran to approximately 4 pages. I said I would come. He walked back across the 40-yard line and got into the helicopter. The door closed. The rotors rose in speed and pitch. The S-92 lifted off the field with the specific authority of something that has done this 10,000 times, and it crossed the south end of the field and went over the oak trees and was gone. The running lights got small, and then smaller, and then nothing. Just the October sky, doing what it always did. The silence after a helicopter lifts off is a particular kind of silence. It fills the space the sound was occupying and takes a moment to become actual quiet. We stood in that moment together, all of us, on the field. Then someone started clapping. It started tentatively, the way those things start. One person deciding, and then 2, and then a row, spreading through the crowd with the specific momentum of people who want to participate in something real and have just been given the opportunity. It wasn't the polite clapping of formality. It was the clapping of people who have watched something happen in front of them and cannot think of a better way to respond. Jen put her arm through mine. I was still holding the certificate. I was also still holding my coffee cup, which was cold by now. I didn't make a speech. I am not a person who makes speeches. I nodded to the people clapping because they were being genuine, and that deserved acknowledgement. And then I found Jen's eyes. She looked at me with 23 years of friendship in her face and said something with her expression that she did not say with words. I said something back with my expression that also did not require words. Then I became aware of Derek Holloway at the edge of the crowd. He was not clapping. He was holding his drink in both hands, and he was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before in the 18 years I had known him at various distances. It was not quite recognition and not quite apology, and it existed in the territory that belongs to a person doing arithmetic they had not expected to be doing, the kind where the answer comes out different than it has been coming out. He looked like a man who was very carefully reconsidering the premises of something he had been confident about for a long time. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked away. Not because I was making a point and not because I was being dramatic. I looked away because I did not have anything I needed from him, and holding a grievance requires a kind of sustained attention that I had learned years ago to redirect toward things that asked for it more honestly. I went back inside with Jen. I got a piece of chocolate cake from the dessert table and ate it standing up near the door. It was good. Jen got a piece and stood next to me, and we didn't talk for a few minutes, and the music played and people drifted back inside with the specific loosened quality of a crowd that has collectively experienced something unexpected and has processed it into conversation and warmth. After a while, Derek came inside. He got a drink and then walked to where Jen and I were standing. Jen straightened slightly, which was the thing she did when she was preparing to intervene on someone's behalf. I put my hand lightly on her arm. Derek stopped a few feet from us. He said my name. I said his. He said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him. He said, "The things I said earlier." He stopped, started again. He said, "I don't actually think you washed out of anything. I've known about Kelton Ridge since it happened. I read it the same week. He looked at his drink. It was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't entirely know why I said what I said. I thought about that." I said, "I think you do." He looked up. I said, "I'm not saying that to be unkind. I think it's actually worth knowing." He was quiet. Then he said, "Maybe." I said, "You fly beautiful aircraft to beautiful places, and it requires real skill and real precision and real courage in ways that are different from what I do. That's not less than what I do. It's just different." He said, "You don't have to be generous right now." I said, "I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate. Those are different things." He nodded slowly. He said, "The conditions you described. Coming into a landing zone that size in what you described." He shook his head. He said, "I don't know that I could have done that." I said, "You'd be surprised what you can do when not doing it isn't an option." He said, "Maybe." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I'm glad you came tonight. I know I made that harder than it should have been." I said, "You made it more interesting." He almost smiled. He said goodnight to Jen, who accepted this with the measured grace of a woman who has decided to be the bigger person and has done the specific internal accounting that tells her she will be at peace with this decision later. He walked away. Jen said, "That was more than he deserved." I said, "Maybe." It was still true, though. She said, "This is the thing about you that simultaneously makes me crazy and explains why you're very good at what you do." I said, "What thing?" She said, "You're not interested in people being wrong. You're only interested in..." I thought about that. I said, "I don't know if it's a virtue. It might just be that I'm too tired to carry things that don't belong to me." She said, "What does it feel like when you put something down?" I looked at the certificate under my arm. I thought about Anna Kessler's careful signature in the bottom corner of the frame. I thought about Marcus Webb walking across a football field in October and saying my name. I said, "Lighter." She nodded. She finished her cake. She said, "Do you want to dance?" I said, "Absolutely not." She said, "Come on." I said, "Jen, it's been a very long night." She said, "You flew a helicopter into a Category 3 ground blizzard." I said, "That was 9 months ago." She said, "Sarah." I said, "Fine." We danced to a slow song from 2008 on the floor of the gymnasium of Millbrook High School, and my left knee had opinions about the floor that it shared with me, without reserve, and Jen laughed when I mentioned this because the knee had been having opinions since a hard landing 3 years ago and had communicated them on many occasions. I laughed because she laughed. The reunion moved on around us. 50 or 60 people from our graduating class and their spouses and partners, moving through the market light and the warm gymnasium air, and the specific comfortable noise of people who are becoming more themselves as the night gets later and the self-consciousness of arrival finally lets go. I drove home at midnight with the framed certificate on the passenger seat of my old Jeep. The roads were empty in the way Vermont roads were empty at midnight in October, dark and straight and lined with trees that were losing their leaves in a way that still looked deliberate. The heater was on low and I had the window cracked because I liked the combination of warm and cold, which is a preference that probably says something about me that I have not entirely parsed. The radio was off. I thought about what Marcus had asked me. What in my life had made me willing to make that decision? I had not given him a full answer because I didn't have one in a form that would have been useful on a football field in front of an audience. But I thought about it on the drive home. I thought about my father handing me a headset and a crop duster before I was tall enough to see the instruments. I thought about a helicopter in a grocery store parking lot and the thing it had felt like to watch a machine arrive specifically for someone who needed exactly it. I thought about 12 years and 44 operations. I thought about 31 pilots I had trained and how training a pilot was a version of the same thing, going where you were needed with what you had, making sure the next person had more than you started with. I thought about the margin Paul Derek had given me 3 times on the flight to Kelton Ridge, the accurate and responsible margin, and how I had heard it completely and then set it to one side because the clearing was not an average situation and the margin was a calculation about averages. There is a kind of courage that looks like recklessness from the outside and feels like clarity from the inside. I don't have another way to describe it. It is not the absence of fear. The fear was there every second of that approach, as present as the instruments and as reliable. It is the decision, made clearly and in full awareness, that the fear does not change what the situation requires. I think that is the only kind of courage there is. I think every other version of it is just waiting to discover what you'll do when the margin runs out and the clearing is waiting. I got home at 12:20 and fed my cat, whose name was Biscuit and who had a personal grievance against closed doors at any hour and expressed it by sitting directly in front of them and staring as if concentration could produce results that had never once occurred. I put the framed certificate on the kitchen table and looked at the 9 signatures for a long time. Then I put it somewhere it would be safe. I was asleep in 4 minutes, which was the thing 12 years of irregular shifts had given me, the ability to be asleep in 4 minutes regardless of what the day had contained. In December, I drove to Burlington for Anna Kessler's dissertation defense. She was 25 years old and she was smaller than I expected, which is a thing I know means nothing but notice anyway. And she wore a dark blazer and her hair was pulled back, and she stood in front of a room full of professors and delivered 4 years of work in a clear and steady voice that did not waver once in the 90 minutes of her presentation. When it was over and the committee had asked everything they intended to ask and stepped out to confer, she came directly to the back of the room where I was sitting. She said, "You came." I said, "You invited me." She said, "I know. I was afraid you wouldn't." I said, "I was afraid you'd make me sit in the front." She looked at me for a moment and then laughed, the kind of laugh that's too large for the room it's in, and the professor's assistant outside the door probably heard it and found it confusing. She said, "Marcus told me you didn't think of it as a rescue, that you said your crew saved us and you just flew." I said, "That's accurate." She said, "Can I tell you what it looked like from where we were standing?" I said, "If you want to." She said, "We had been in that shelter for 6 hours. The wind had taken the south wall down twice, and Marcus had rebuilt it each time with whatever was available, which was inadequate. I had stopped shivering, which Marcus knew was not a good sign. There was no light from the sky. There was almost no light at all, and then there was a sound, this very specific mechanical sound that was absolutely impossible given what the conditions were, because we all knew what was outside. We knew what the wind was doing, we knew what the temperature was, and the sound said that something was coming anyway. She looked at me. She said, "That is what rescue sounds like. Not a voice, not a light, just a sound that tells you that someone decided to come anyway despite everything that told them not to." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I'm glad the sound was loud enough." She said, "I'm glad you made it." We shook hands. She went back to wait for her committee. I sat in the back row of the seminar room and looked at her title slide on the projection screen. 4 years of work on winter ecology in the Green Mountains of Vermont. And I thought about what it meant to do the careful and specific work of adding something to the world's understanding of itself, and how sometimes that work puts you somewhere that requires someone else to do a different kind of work, and how neither kind diminishes the other. The world needs both the person who maps the ecology of a winter ridge and the person who shows up when the ridge goes wrong. It needs the people who know what the place contains and the people who know how to get there. The committee came back. They announced their result. Anna Kessler shook every hand in the room and then came to the back and found me and shook mine last. And she said, "Thank you." And I said, "Congratulations." And that was the whole of it. And it was enough. And it was exactly what it needed to be. What no one tells you about a job that asks everything you have is that at some point you stop asking whether everything you have will be enough. The question becomes irrelevant. The clearing does not care about the question. The clearing cares about whether you show up and what you do when you get there. I have flown into darkness and ice and conditions that the forecast did not anticipate. I have landed in places that were not landing zones and made them into landing zones by arriving. I have trained 31 pilots to go where they are needed with what they have, and some of them have surpassed me, which is the only genuinely good outcome of training anyone for anything. I am not a commercial pilot. I did not fail to become one. I was offered a route, and I gave it back because the route was not the job. The job was always the clearing. The specific dark place that needed something to arrive. The places where the sound of rotors is not ambient noise, but the particular sound of someone deciding that not going was not an option they were willing to take. The job you choose when you are paying attention is not always the job that looks like success from the outside. Sometimes it asks for more and gives back less, that is visible. Sometimes it is the one that nobody raises a glass to. The one that requires everything on a Tuesday night in January when the weather has failed and 9 people are depending on a decision you are making in the dark. You make the decision, you go toward the clearing, you land. The rest of it, the certificate, the signatures, the trauma surgeon on a football field in October, the doctoral student laughing in a seminar room in December, the quiet that settled in me on the drive home at midnight with the framed glass catching the headlights of oncoming cars, all of that is what comes after. It is not why you go. You go because you are the person with the thing in your hands that can get you there. You go because someone decided long before the night in question that this was what they were going to be. You go because the alternative is not acceptable and has never been acceptable and will not become acceptable simply because the forecast changed or the margin went away or the person 3 feet to your left at a 15-year reunion decided that what you chose was lesser than what he chose. And then one day, you are standing on a football field at your 15-year high school reunion with a cup of cold coffee in your hands, and the rotors come over the tree line, and someone walks across the 40-yard line and says your name. Not the name on a departure board or a hotel registration. Your name. The one that belongs to the person who decided, a long time ago, before she had the words for it, that the clearing mattered more than the margin. That decision is not measured by whether the room applauds it or whether the person 3 feet to your left understands it. It is measured by whether the sound arrives when it is needed, whether 9 people standing in the cold and the dark hear the rotors and know that someone is coming. That is the measure. Everything else is weather in a city you used to live in. You show up. You fly toward what needs you. You land. That has always been the whole of it.